How's it going today, guys? So today I'm going to be sharing with you one of the most important business lessons I have ever learned. Now this is something I actually learned about just a couple of weeks ago. I was at the Synergy Global Forum in New York City and I was listening to a speech by Guy Kawasaki, and he was talking about this curve or the bell curve of business or any trend. So what he talks about here is the fact that there is a trend or there is a bell curve when it comes to any business. And you will fall somewhere along this curve as somebody who gets involved with this business. So if you're one of the first people to market, if you're one of the first people to catch on a trend, then you are among the innovators. And then we have a little further along here, these early adopters. These are people who maybe they weren't on the cutting edge of it, but they did pick up on it early. And then you have the early majority, the late majority, and then the late adopters all together. And obviously this right here is the start of a trend, and over here is the end of the trend. So Guy Kawasaki talked about how most businesses and most companies out there make a mistake. And what that mistake is that they cling to one thing that worked for them. Whatever it is that initially gave them that success, they identify themselves as that one thing. So I'm going to be giving you guys a couple of examples of companies out there that have followed this mistake, and they ended up clinging to the one thing that had gotten them successful, the one thing that worked for them, and it ended up being the death of them, or it really hurt their business. And they went from being one of these innovators at the beginning of the trend to having this trend essentially lead them to their grave in some cases, or to the point where they are no longer as relevant. So with any business out there, there's going to be a trend, and that trend is going to be the level of interest in that product or service. And early on, if you get in on something early, there's going to be a high demand for that service. A lot of people are going to be interested, or they're going to be buying that product. But over time, as new things come out, or as the old stuff just becomes less interesting and people stop buying it, you're going to see that trend taper off. What Guy Kawasaki said is that most businesses start on the curve, they live on the curve, but then they make the mistake of dying on the curve. So what that means, guys, is they identify themselves as one set thing. They identify themselves as what was able to make them successful, the one thing that worked for them, but then they make the mistake of clinging to that one thing even when it begins to die off or taper off. When people are no longer interested in that product or that service and there are less people buying it, they're still going to cling to that one thing because that is all they know. So what I want you guys to think about is not so much catching on one trend and having that be the one thing that makes you successful. You have to think about how to catch on many different trends and ride the waves, if you will. So that is the mistake that companies and businesses make, is they cling to the one thing that made them successful, but then they never let go to it. They never move to the next big thing. They stick with that one thing. So your goal should always be to get to the next curve. Your goal is not to ride something out as long as possible. Your goal is to pick up on a trend early, be one of the first people to market, and then get to the next curve, get to the next trend. Be one of these innovators. You don't want to be one of these early majority or late adopters. These are the people who get in late on something and they're riding out the end of it. They're coasting at the end of it. At this point, the life cycle of this trend is dying and people are trying to get the last bit of money out of something. You want to be somebody who is in there early. You're one of the first adopters or the innovators, and then you figure out what the next big thing is and you move over to that. So I want to give you guys a few examples of big companies and big names that have absolutely failed at this. First of all on the list, we have Blockbuster. So Blockbuster became very popular when people wanted to rent VHS tapes at home. So you could go to the rental store, rent a VHS, take it home and watch it, and they had a nice little business there. Now, we shifted from VHS to DVD, but Blockbuster was able to stay relevant because all they had to do was phase in those DVDs and phase out those VHS tapes. But then something happened. The way people consumed media changed, and it shifted from that of renting things at a physical store to just streaming them online. And Blockbuster ignored this trend. They stuck to what worked. What worked for them in the past was renting out movies and a retail location, and they failed to get to the next curve. They failed to get to the next trend, and as a result, they allowed that rental business to bury them and bring them to their grave as far as those retail locations go. The main problem with Blockbuster is they defined themselves with the service they provided, which was retail movie rentals. They did not identify themselves as an entertainment company. If they simply had the vision of delivering entertainment to customers in the best way possible, they would have caught on to the shift from rentals to streaming, and they would have been one of the early adopters to the streaming services. But instead, they were stubborn, and they clung to what had worked for them in the past, and then when that died off, Blockbuster died off as well. So they clung to this curve, and they hung on for dear life, and eventually people stopped renting movies altogether, and you saw Blockbuster locations all over the country start closing. Now there was another similar company out there to Blockbuster, and that is Redbox. Now Redbox had a bit of a flash in the pan there as far as popularity. So they picked up on this idea that people don't want to go out of their way to go rent movies. You don't want to go to an actual store. If you can rent a movie while you're already somewhere else, like the grocery store, or maybe you're at a mall, if you can go up to a kiosk and rent a DVD instead of going to an actual retail store, then that would be more convenient. However, again, once people stopped watching media on a disc and started streaming it, Redbox completely fell out of the game because they defined themselves as a rental kiosk. They didn't define themselves as an entertainment company. Both of these companies here could have simply had the vision of delivering entertainment to customers in the best way possible, and they would have had this idea. They would have known to get to the next curve, which was very clearly streaming. Now, this didn't just happen overnight. These companies were losing market share to streaming services, but they were stubborn and they didn't change because they clung to what worked in the past, even though it wasn't working today. Another perfect example of this are the camera companies Kodak and Polaroid. Both of these companies were some of the first to have film cameras where you could take photos and then the photos would be on a film and you bring them to the pharmacy and you get them developed and then you have your pictures a few days later. So that was a very hot trend for a long time until things went digital, okay? And these companies, not so much Kodak, but Polaroid especially, these companies failed to pick up on that trend. They didn't get to the next curve. It was very clear that things were going digital, but they refused to innovate. They stuck to what worked. They identified themselves as film camera companies, and as a result, they didn't shift over to the digital side of photography. And that was the death of the business for Polaroid, and that really hurt Kodak because Kodak is no longer one of the top camera companies out there. They were at one point one of the innovators. They were at one point one of the big camera companies, but because they didn't get to the next curve and they ignored the shift to digital, that really hurt them in the long run. And then my final example of this is Sony. At one point, Sony was a really hot company because they had the Walkman. People loved the Walkman. Everyone and their brother was buying one of these, and for a while Sony was the hot company as far as portable media devices go. When people wanted to listen to radio or cassette tapes while they were working out or whatever, or taking a walk. But what they failed to do is shift from hardware to software. That is why companies like Apple were able to step in and make better software and make better media devices, and that phased out Sony and the Walkman. Imagine if Sony had picked up on that trend and they had shifted from hardware to software, then you could have seen Sony be in the position that Apple is in today. And instead, they clung to what worked, which was hardware, and when that shifted to software, when the new trend was about software, they just didn't keep up. So that is another example of a company that stuck to what worked and eventually it died off. So what Guy Kawasaki said in this speech is that you should define your business by the services you provide, not how you provide them. So if Blockbuster defined themselves as an entertainment company, a company that delivered entertaining media to customers in the best way possible, they would not be where they are today. If Redbox did the same thing, they would not be where they are today. If Kodak and Polaroid defined themselves as camera companies and technology companies and always trying to be in on the next big thing, they would not be where they are today. And if Sony had focused on delivering the best media devices to consumers and they didn't stick to the hardware side of things, they would not be where they are today, guys. This is one of the most important business lessons I have ever learned. And I want to share with you guys my own thoughts on this and how this relates to my business. So I could sit here and define myself as a YouTuber, someone who posts videos on YouTube, and that is where I get most of my views, and that's where most people follow me. But instead, I think of myself as an educator and someone who shares value and information with other people. I don't want to identify myself as a YouTuber because what would happen if YouTube started to die off and people shifted to a different platform? Think about what happened with Vine when people defined themselves as a Vine creator and then Vine disappeared. You need to define yourself by the benefits that you are providing people. For me, it is education. I define myself as an educator and an influencer, not a YouTuber, because if YouTube were to die off, then I would try to get to the next curve. I would figure out where is everyone going if they're not watching content on YouTube, and I would move to that platform. Anyways, guys, I thought this was a really interesting lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please drop a like on this video, share any feedback you have with me in the comments section below. And if you guys are new to my channel, please consider subscribing to be notified of any future uploads. And as always, I thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.